Oh, but now we have conflict in our world, and this is a very, very strange situation for us to all be dealing with. But it does point out the fact that part of the oppositions of a world where we have separate identities and separate cultures and people feeling there's an us and a them and an other over there, there's going to be conflict unless we figure out ways to coexist with one another. So to open the Myth Salon today, I would like, as I do, to have a moment of silence for all of the people everywhere, but here going through COVID, over there going through conflict. And let's see if we can have a little bit of harmony and love and coexistence in the Myth Salon today. I'd like to read a poem today that comes from one of my all-time favorite natural world wildness poets, Robinson Jeffers. This is a poem called Not Man Apart. Then, what is the answer? Not to be deluded by dreams, to know that great civilizations have broken down into violence and their tyrants come many times before. When open violence appears, to avoid it with honor, or choose the least ugly faction. These evils are essential. To keep one's own integrity, be merciful, uncorrupted, and not wish for evil. Don't be duped by dreams of universal justice or happiness. These dreams will not be fulfilled. To know this, and know that however ugly the parts appear, the whole remains beautiful. A severed hand is an ugly thing, and man, dissevered from the earth and the stars and his history, often appears atrociously ugly. Integrity is wholeness. The greatest beauty is organic wholeness, the wholeness of life and things, the divine beauty of the universe. Love that. Love that, not man apart from that. So here we are, another beautiful afternoon in Southern California. We can dangle that in front of Dennis Merritt, who is coping with zero temperature up in Wisconsin. And I imagine it's not too much warmer than that down where Diane is in Ohio. So I welcome Ryan Maher today. He comes out of the Chicago Jung Institute community, although he's now up in Washington. I think today it really speaks to the whole nature of what the Myth Salon has become. Look at the people that we have in the panel. They come from all over the country, and we convene in a place of community and coalescence. So Will, my good buddy, I would digress and tell them what an afternoon you and I had, but maybe you'll find a way to talk about that yourself. But right now, I'd like to turn it over to you, and thank you, brother. Beautiful afternoon.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful afternoon, and certainly in California. Last session we were together was for the Dr. Tarnas event around changing of the gods, and one of our main focuses was on challenging the paradigms of thought that have been incompatible with astrology. And so what that became is a larger challenge to the disenchanted paradigm of reductive, materialistic, mechanistic, reality without soul, wasteland. And so it's only almost perfect that we're going to shift in our next session today into re-enchanting reality, which is a wonderful conversation, and one that I hope also does touch what we were doing this afternoon today. Dana, we were, just to share, we were in virtual realities today, looking at new enchanted dimensions, and looking at how to make sure that virtual realities are not new realities without soul, but are new domains for the soul's exploration. And I also have to comment. It is a somber day in the world, and I think it'd be I think can't go without mentioning. Obviously, I think all of us. It's nice since we are all together and have a moment of shared consciousness. Maybe it is worth maybe feeling in ourselves a little bit of shared care and love and wish and hope for people going through the worst right now. With that, I'll try and shift gears. I'm sure all of us will have that in the back of our hearts. And I'm afraid this may be one of those, I remember where I was that day, and this will be where we were that day. So I hope that we can make the most of it and form meaningful memories that'll turn into synchronicities for us to make sense of for decades. Why were we doing this that day? Talking about re-enchanting our world. Hopefully there's meaning to it. I suspect we'll find it. Dr. Dana White, who contributes to the faculty of Pacificus Myth PhD program, hosts this Myth Salon and produces books on mythology. My name is Will Lynn. It's my privilege to introduce the panels. I founded mythhouse.org in the general education department at Husson College, where I teach myth to storytellers. We're also joined by Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery, who is a distinguished emeritus professor in the mythological studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of 30 volumes, including 7 volumes on poetry and 1 novel. His latest collection of essays is The Way of Myth, Stories, Subtle Wisdom, from 2021. His paintings, pottery, blogs, and book titles, as well as upcoming events and trips, can be found at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. Hi, Dennis. Missed you last week. We're also joined this week by Dr. Voris Nunley. Voris is a professor of philosophy, literature, and rhetoric at the University of California, Riverside, who lectures across the country on the intersection of literature, spirituality, myth, and contemporary life, with an interest in the dark feminine, race, and transformation. Hey, Voris. We have Dr. Diane Sherwood with us this evening, who co-authored a book with the late analyst Joseph L. Henderson, relating a series of alchemical illuminations to the process of depth transformation of the psyche, the symbolic alchemy of the splendor soulless. She is also published on a wide range of topics and serves as a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. She is a certified Jungian psychoanalyst and a child and adolescent analyst through the International Association for Analytical Psychology, the IAAP, and a teaching member of the Sandplay Therapists of America. Welcome back, Diane. Hi. We're joined this evening by Dr. Betsy Perlis. Hi, thanks for being with us tonight. Betsy is a guide and trainer with the School of Lost Borders, a nonprofit that focuses on revitalizing wilderness rite of passage ceremonies for modern times. In addition, she has a private psychotherapy practice in Grass Valley, California, and is currently an advanced candidate in analytical training at the analytical training program at the C.G. Jung Institute of Colorado. She teaches eco-psychology courses at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she also earned her PhD in depth psychology in 2004. Dr. Dennis Merritt. Hi, Dr. Dennis Merritt. Thanks for being with us tonight. Nice to meet you this evening. Dennis is a Jungian psychoanalyst and eco-psychologist in private practice in Madison and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the author of the 4-volume set of Jung, Hermes, and Eco-Psychology, the Diary Farmer's Guide to the Universe, volumes 1 through 4. Oh, sorry, the Dairy Farmer's Guide to the Universe, volumes 1 through 4, published by the Fisher King Press, of course. He's a diplomat of the Jung Institute in Zurich and his degrees from Sonoma State, UC Berkeley, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has over 25 years of participation in Lakota Sioux ceremonies that have strongly influenced his worldview. Ryan Maher. thanks for leading us tonight, is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice near Seattle, where he works with individuals and couples navigating personal and relational conflicts, experiences of loss, and feelings of meaninglessness. He is a graduate of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and the Jungian Psychotherapy program at the Jung Institute of Chicago. As a certified yoga teacher and hypnotherapist, Ryan has over 20 years of experience working with the mind, body, psyche, soma relationship. Wow. Dr. Laura Vecchiola is a graduate of the Jungian Psychotherapy program at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. She's a clinical psychologist in private practice in the Chicago area and specializes in working with dying, death, and traumatic loss. Laura has conducted academic research studying the parallels between the healing experiences of trauma survivors and the archetypal pattern of the hero's journey. She's also published several chapter contributions that highlight the mythopoeic nature of the psyche and the importance of enduring modern myths such as Star Wars, Game of Thrones, and Wonder Woman. Thanks for being with us tonight. And now I'll hand it over. I'm looking forward to a wonderful evening and conversation with all of you, some old friends and some new.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Will, so much for inviting me to be a part of the Myth Salon this evening. Thank you to the panelists. It is an enormous honor to be among such highly esteemed, accomplished thinkers, healers, and imaginaries. And thank you for everyone who is joining us this evening. I am honored to have you with us as we venture into the wilderness and encounter some of the chthonic creatures and inhabitants of that domain. I was thinking about how the witch and Pan are inherently tricksters, and I had a bit of a trickster right at the beginning of signing on. I don't have access to my notes, so we are going to truly go into the darkness without a light this evening. And I hope you all will be patient with me as I feel around. People do not exploit a nature that speaks to them. How do we define nature? What does nature mean to us in a world that is still so influenced by Cartesian duality? The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Jung invites us to really appreciate how the unconscious affects the external world. And what fates are we weaving for ourselves in the intersecting crises occurring externally? And what does that say about our inner situation individually and collectively? Enchantment is the oldest form of medicine. We will be looking at themes of descent and renewal this evening, and specifically enchantment's role in helping us to navigate those archetypal experiences. We use the image of the fence as our starting point here. The fence demarcates the opposites, an in here and an out there. The opposites, some specific opposites that we will navigate this evening: wilderness and civilization, the rational, the non-rational, the masculine and feminine principle, among some others, light and dark. The fence also invites us to be curious about thresholds and boundaries. The conundrum of these opposites is that what might we learn through duality, through a contrast that can be appreciated or seen through the opposites? And equally, what are the risks associated with the opposites, how they might perpetuate systems of othering? One of the words that's used for witch hag is an old High German word that means fence. And the Hagazusa was a being that sat on the fence. She had the ability to travel between worlds, to go into the forest, into the nighttime consciousness, into the underworld, and from that place bring back insights, wisdoms that can be integrated for individual and collective healing and evolution. This is an excerpt from a Wendell Berry poem via a book by Stanton Marlin, The Black Sun. To go in the dark with the light is to know the light. To know the dark, go dark. Go without sight and find that the dark too blooms and sings and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding, the Tao Te Ching. And so we move into the dark with the earnest effort to resist the temptation to bring light so that we can truly know the dark. The shadow of the light. For a number of philosophers, Heidegger, Foucault, Derrida, and others, there's a dangerous tendency in modernity toward closure and tautological reductionism, as well as speaking to a moment ago, totalization, normalization, and domination. Levin has noted that behind our Western visionary tradition lies the shadow of phalocentrism, logocentrism, and a heliopolitics driven by the violence of the light. To put it more simply, the concern about modernity is that it is governed by mal-desire and power, and by an egocentric rationality that serves political agendas that conceal intrinsic violence. We will return to this towards the end when we delve into the pan archetype and the negative side of that archetype. Two images here that I think capture the violence of the phalocentrism, heliocentrism based politics. Two figures here devouring the new life that could be potential in the interest of preserving their grip on power. I think we could consider both of these images as depicting a paranoid, patriarchal fear of a renewal, of a shift in things. And it's important to note that with any image, there are multiple interpretations. So this image on the left here, taken, as many of you know, from the Lamb Spring series, Jeffrey Raff goes into some detail in interpreting this as the integration of the Filius and the spiritual insights embodied in the Filius. So we're able to hold paradox here, multiple meanings and interpretations. We're going to look at several images and paintings from Goya. This one, the inscription says, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." Dana, a few months ago, excuse me, you brought it to my attention that monster means to show, from the Latin monstrare, to show, to reveal, to warn. As we hold paradox, I think we can appreciate that the sleep of reason produces monsters, but also that reason's lack of sleep likewise produces monsters. what becomes constellated when there is a one-sided identification with reason, with the light, and then what gets othered, scapegoated. Let's take a journey into the forest here. Entering the deep woods, any human being is rendered small and young by a great forest, seemingly endless and eternal. The forest is a place of loneliness, entanglement, healing, regression, loftiness and obstruction, spontaneous growth and continuous decay. What is primeval in ourselves is animated by the primeval forest. When we enter the forest, not in the interest to dominate or to extract physical resources, we have the opportunity to encounter our own unconscious, our own selves, to come face to face with the natural world, which is often inherently othered in our Cartesian paradigm. And from this experience, really have an expansion of consciousness. There's increasing research and evidence on how even the I think it's Dennis, you'll know this, the terrapins, the chemicals that are released by trees can influence our gut biome, our mood, our biochemical composition. Edinger says that the classical symbol for alienation is the image of the wilderness. And it is here characteristically that some manifestation of God is encountered. When the wanderer lost in the desert is about to perish, a source of divine nourishment appears. We're encountering Rudolf Otto's holy other, and the Latin root for alienation, being alienus, is another, right? So the entrance into the forest inherently has a way of positioning us into relationship with the other. The image on the left, of course, of Dante entering into the forest midway upon life. Jung's journeys in the inner wilderness in the Red Book, and some passages really summoning up the energy of the woods or the forest. The fairy tale Vasilisa, which we'll look at in some detail. Hansel and Gretel, of course, so many stories in folklore, fairy tales involve the journeying into the forest. And Snow White is an interesting one in that, contrary to most stories and plot developments where the protagonist goes into the forest, Snow White, of course, enters the enchanted sleep, and the forest, the wilderness, reclaims civilization. We might think about possibilities that exist if we stay in a disenchanted, dissociative sleep. The witch. Nature in its occult aspect, the craftily uncanniness behind the semblance of things, is embodied in the witch. She creates illusions, is a caster of spell, a mistress of disguise. She baffles, confounds, veils, and unveils. Her beautiful, enchanting, hideous, poisonous, magical, sexual, and deathly secrets, the witch is always at the vital center of things. She brings us to our true nature. She sets things in motion, stirs the pot, is instigator and matrix of fateful odysseys and transformations. She is also the weird earth of our restoration. She makes things so intolerable that we are forced to break the lock. She scares the life into us. It deserves mentioning that the images of witches depicted in the presentation from Goya are a criticism on the Spanish Inquisition and the horrors that were perpetuated by that movement and other religious fanaticism movements that inherently other people. So we're holding the paradox of these images. Taken psychologically, what emotions are evoked when we observe these images? The witch and Pan inherently create discomfort. They're figures, chthonic figures that disrupt our inner status quo, the external status quo, when they might be constellated. It's also worth mentioning here that Pan is not synonymous with the horn deity depicted here. There is a difference between them. So we want to, maintain consciousness of that. However, there are a lot of similarities that we can appreciate. Their connection to the natural world, the goat legs, hairy legs that bring a real deep connection to the instinctual world. Juxtaposed or complementary to that, the horns, which denote a closeness with the sacred. A few motifs worth mentioning in this image. We have flight, the backwards position of the witches on the broom, and the owl here. The flight invites us into an appreciation of the witch's ability to rise up above the dramas down below and to see the patternings that are working on earth, that are at work, that are manifesting. The meta perspective. The flight also allows the witch to move between realms, between worlds, the underworld, the wilderness, civilization. And the backwards motif is one that suggests that a different perspective is what will lead the way. That, and taking that further, that the lowest part of the broom here is what is guiding here, the witches, the part that clears away debris, that sweeps and cleanses, is also that which is lowest in making contact with the ground. And the owl, deep in Haruki Murakami's long novel, 1Q84, he has a concise summary of the owl being the guardian deity of the woods, the keeper of nighttime wisdom and knowledge. And the archetype of the witch is the being who can bring us into contact with those sources of insight and wisdom. Baba Yaga is a famous Slavic character who lives very deep in the woods. She has a mercurial and paradoxical nature. Contrary to a lot of the witches in fairy tales that are either associated with good or bad, Baba Yaga really possesses both potentials, often at the same time. She is also an agent of transformation. She is a chthonic earth goddess who certainly invokes a sense of dread, awfulness, but also in addition to an awfulness, awe-filledness. There are 4 main plot points we're going to look at in the fairy tale Vasilisa the Beautiful or Vasilisa the Wise. The things that start the story, that set things in motion, are the death of Vasilisa's mother, who Dr. Estes refers to as the too good mother. The mother that has to die so that the young, naive, innocent Psyche can differentiate, individuate. Prior to dying, however, Vasilisa's mother gives her a enchanted doll with the instructions that she has to keep it a secret and feed it and give it water and rest. And so we can extrapolate that enchantment requires our tending to, right? Rather than our passive posturing, expecting a enchanting experience to shake us out of our sleep, we have to effort, nourish enchantment. The death of the mother brings Vasilisa into the descent, captured by the stepmother, the evil stepmother and evil stepsisters, who are very cruel to Vasilisa and force her into the forest, a further descent, in search of Baba Yaga to get light. The true hope, however, is that the true hope of the evil stepmother and stepsisters is that Vasilisa will be eaten by the Yaga. And so Vasilisa journeys into the forest. She makes her way to Baba Yaga and has the encounter with the dark feminine, with the witch, with the Baba Yaga mother goddess. And Baba Yaga, as many of you know, imparts these impossible tasks, which is such a common motif that would be utterly unattainable if it were not for the talisman, the enchanted doll. And upon completing the task, Vasilisa asks Baba Yaga a series of questions. There are these disembodied hands that come out. A striking image that was in the poem you shared. I was struck by that, Dana. And the key point here is Vasilisa doesn't ask too many questions. There's already wisdom here that she's gained. And then renewal, the return to her home and the confrontation with another embodiment, much more shadow embodiment, I think, with the evil stepmother and stepsisters. Oh, I forgot the gift from the chthonic Baba Yaga, the skull there that you see with the light inside. And it is this gaze, the light that was attained in the depths of the descent, is what ultimately vanquishes the evil stepmother and stepsisters. I just want to read briefly from Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. My disunion with myself and uncertainty in the world at large led me to an action which at that time was quite incomprehensible to me. He's a schoolboy at this time. I had in those days a yellow varnished pencil case of the kind commonly used by primary school pupils, with a little lock and customary ruler. At the end of this ruler, I now carved a little mannequin about 2 inches long, with a frock coat, top hat, and shiny black boots. I colored him black with ink, sawed him off the ruler, and put him in the pencil case where I made him a little bed. I even made a coat for him out of a bit of wool. And then he put it up in the off-limits attic. In the case, he also placed an oblong blackish stone from the Rhine, which I, Jung, painted with watercolors to look as though it were divided into an upper half and a lower half. Keep this in mind when we get to Pan. This was his stone, mannequin stone. All this was a great secret. Secretly, I took the case to the forbidden attic at the top of the house. The meaning of these actions or how I might explain them never worried me. I contented myself with the feeling of new won security and was satisfied to possess something that no one knew and no one could get at. It was an inviolable secret which must never be betrayed, for the safety of my life depended on it. The little wooden figure with the stone was a first attempt, still unconscious and childish, to give shape to the secret. We see another talisman here and a key enchanted object that helps to navigate a pivotal threshold experience, experience that helped both Vasilisa and Jung make their way through very uncertain waters. And the emphasis on how necessary it was to summon those experiences up, the place in taking care of the doll for Vasilisa and creating the mannequin for Jung. The great mother and goddess, according to myriad images that had survived from the great span of human prehistory on the Eurasian continents, it was the sovereign mystery and creative power of the female as a source of life that developed into the earliest religious experience. The earth's ability to sustain, provide life, and then the terrible power to take life was first imaged in these goddess figurines. This brings us to a similar motif: the Virgin, the Mother, the Crone. The three-faced triple goddess, a motif found through mythologies and traditions all throughout the world. You might think of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, other manifestations of this ad nauseum. And the critical relationship between the crone and the Virgin, denoting the mysterious relationship that exists in nature between death, life, rebirth. And if we take a moment to look at the ecology of old growth forests, we can appreciate how the line separating life and death is very thin. It becomes porous. Where does life end and death begin, and vice versa? We're thinking of the trees as living entities doesn't really end after they fall, right? In fact, I think that there's potentially a micro environment for greater biodiversity once a tree has fallen than when it is actually standing. Well, Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and the underworld, a chthonic goddess, the goddess of crossroads, thresholds, here depicted in an image that can invoke strong emotions, fear, discomfort. We're really invited into the underworld with this image. Hecate was the goddess of doorways associated with guardian dogs. She could help on the process of self-discovery in bringing us into greater relationship with our own inner wilderness and unconscious. We have two other images here depicting Hecate in her triple form. The image on the left, Blake's image, is unique in that there are the two aspects in back that are facing inward. I think this creates a sense of mystery. You know, you can see part of Hecate, but you can't know her in her entirety. You can't see all of her faces at once. We also have the example of the zoomorphic nature of the great goddess, you know, different animal embodiments here being the owl. I think it's the horse, the bat, and a snake. I think there may be a snake head, a dragon head. In the image on the right, you can appreciate how, contrary to Blake's depiction, Hecate's ability to see in all directions at once. Here we have the triple goddess facing outward. And at crossroads, three masts were often placed facing each road. Sometimes structures were built in her honor facing each direction, and honor would be paid at that crossroads for a safe passage in the journey. The items in her hands, we've got the torch, which brings light into the unconscious, into the dark. And the key, as goddess of doorways and passages, she's also an opener of doors. And the snake there, capturing Hecate's domain over the life, death, life mysteries. The Moirai, always depicted in three. Clotho, the spinner, Lachesis, the apportioner, and Atropos, the cutter, the inevitable. Spinning the days of our lives, weaving the web of life. We have an analogous manifestation in First Nations traditions, particularly Hopi and Navajo in Spider Woman. Not sure if that influenced any of the later incarnations of Spider Woman. Laura, you might know more about that. And the Moirai also being depicted in Macbeth. Don't know if anyone's seen the most recent iteration of that. Really powerful, moving scene that plays with the one and the three in the goddess. And we're, through this image, we're allowed a deeper inquiry into Jung's salient point in Aeon of the psychological rule that inner situations, when not made conscious, are experienced outside as fate. The cauldron, central image in the witch iconography, circular and cyclical, the opposite of hierarchy. Womb-like, endlessly turning, a boiling matrix, a soup of elemental raw materials in the cosmic womb. The cauldron represented the stuff of creation, the mother's eternal flux. The juxtaposition of these two images can capture both potentialities. The close relationship between death and life, the elixir on the left, potential for healing concoctions and stews, and the image to the right here. What fates are we weaving for ourselves individually, collectively, in the continuing status quo that's contributing to an intensification of natural processes, storms, increasing intensity and frequency, wildfires, the hurricanes. And imagining the Gulf of Mexico as a cauldron. What are we doing to it? Deepwater Horizon, and consequently, what will it do to us? Pan. There's a little bit of a separation between a cosmic pan and a pastoral pan. From my understanding, the cosmic pan is really a misinterpretation of the Greek pan for all. This positioned pan in pretty prominent place in cosmology, akin to the Titans or Zeus. I think more historically accurate, from my understanding, is the pastoral pan, taken from the verb pan. Pan represents a consciousness that is close to nature, deeply interwoven with the body. We remember Jung's stone from the Rhine and the calling, the inspiration to separate that stone between a bottom half and an upper half. And we've got the very instinctual nature animal world of Pan's legs, the hairiness, the goat-like nature of them, and the more human upper half. And the mythology here of the nymph Syrinx, we will look at Pan's relationship with the feminine principle in a little bit more detail moment here. But in this mythology, of course, Syrinx, avoiding Jung's Pan's pursuits, and receiving the aid of the gods to become a reed, which Pan then cuts and fashions his pipes from. Pan's place is the wilds, the caves obscure, the dark recesses of the psyche. The nature outside and the nature inside. And Pan, of course, is the god of panic. What a prominent place in our society today, where anxiety and panic are commonplace and ubiquitous experiences. And taking that further, I won't be able to read the quote in its entirety because it was in my notes, but the writer and occultist Dion Fortune wrote a book in the 1920s called The Goat-Footed God, I believe. And she talks about how when Pan's driven underground, he emerges in the spread of disease, and at this juncture with the COVID pandemic, I think we can appreciate that. Looking at this beautiful painting, I'm struck by how small the figure of Pan and Syrinx is here. It is almost as though that's not the point. We see it, it's there. Pan in his negatively constellated iteration, his violent pursuit, desire for control and power, domination. And we're also drawn to what occupies more space in the painting, this natural landscape, this wilderness, if you will. The power of the unconscious principle in the waterfall, the water, enormous waterfall there, in the deep recesses of the psyche here. Voris shared an incredible quote with me that I think is captured a little bit here in this image. When we look in the center, there is a structure there. Looks like it might be a building or a tower of some sort. So we can see civilization there, whatever civilization might represent to any of us, but it's so faint, almost an apparition. Civilization as the promise for order in the disorder. Also civilization that perpetuates the violent tendencies of a phallocentric, one-sided association with logic and reason. And what better structure to represent that than this rectangular tower or building off in the distance. Continuing with Pan's relationship with the feminine, the myth of Pan and Psyche, which is depicted in the image to the right there, can invite us into Pan's softer side. I think this image is, keeping a little bit of Pan's dominant orientation with how high above Psyche he is here. But in the gaze and the gesture, there is a compassion there, and we know that he's consoling Psyche after her plunge into the river, her attempted suicide, following Eros's discovery that she looked at him, betrayed in the gaze. The myth of Pan in Salon denotes the possibility that Pan possesses shame. To win Salon over, Pan hides his goat legs underneath a sheepskin, hiding his nature, his instinctual side. And the problematic power relationship with the nymphs. The nymphs, we spoke about Syrinx. Pitti's chase by Pan results in her, in one iteration, being turned into a pine tree, which is sacred to Pan. In another iteration, she implants herself in Gaia and then grows to become a pine tree. And Echo, another nymph, trying to avoid Pan's pursuit, becomes captured by nymphs, shepherd followers, dismembered, and then Gaia buries Echo's dismembered parts into herself, into the earth. Her Echo remains. This is obviously different from the Echo and Narcissus mythological stream. And in the three nymphs, we see a close relationship with nature, with the earth, with Gaia. Which takes us into an inquiry of a negatively constellated Pan archetype, one that is about control, about power, domination. And so if we can turn toward Pan individually, collectively, and face that instead of dissociating that potential, might we be in right relationship with those instinctual tendencies? Early in the first millennium, it was eventually declared that the great god Pan is dead. Hollis says that yes, Pan was slain by solemn sobriety, yet imprisoned underground. He still attacks individuals in panic attacks and collectively in the excesses of our popular culture and our nationalistic frenzies. Hillman, who described Pan and the Pan complex as possessing the twin nuclei of desire and despair, states that when Pan is dead, then nature can be controlled by the will of a new god, man, modeled in the image of Prometheus or Hercules, creating from it and polluting in it without a troubled conscience. A new God modeled in the image of man. We are in the realm of ego, of course, and Pan, the witch, the forest, all possess the ego relativizing potential. Yes, Voris, thank you. Pan, the only Greek god to die. Well, what does that mean? The only Greek god to die is the god of nature and instinct. The repression, the dissociation of Pan, and the consequential surfacing of Pan's more negative potentials and attributes in other forms. We see in the pillaging of the earth's resources, the othering of other human beings. And this diagram is taken from, of course, Jung's model of the psyche. Wanted to depict the two archetypes that we've been circling, the witch and Pan, as they might manifest through a activated complex in the instance of Pan here. You can see it crossing the threshold of consciousness. And the latent potential of the witch there in the unconscious. Trying to be mindful around moving into generalities or stereotypes here. We can appreciate the symptoms or the expressions of these complexes. For Pan, panic, nightmares, breathing problems, compulsive sexual behavior, deceitfulness, sexually violent behavior, restlessness, tendency toward domination, a need toward domination. Oh, I meant to mention that the mother wound of Pan. Upon being born, Pan's mother sees the goat legs, the horns, and flees. And even though after Hermes brings Pan to Mount Olympus, he has this wonderful reception, and the gods and goddesses love him, adore him. I think he's wonderful. There's still that initial mother wound, the abandonment. So how might that also influence the neurotic desire for connection with the feminine principle that is based in a negative dominating position? The witch archetype, some attributes we might think of: cruelty, reclusiveness, preoccupation with death, false hopes of immortality, devouring of others, controlling, seductive, two-faced. These are complexes. These are the negative pole of the spectrum, the archetype. Thinking in here, we can also think of the word rage, the experience of rage. Extend this into an inquiry of different iterations of rage. Bell Hooks delineating between a rage of the oppressors, the rage of the privileged, the rage of the other, the oppressed. And the way that these two archetypes are inviting us into the potential for increased consciousness around these potentials. I didn't want to just focus on the negative complex possibility, so we can see the other end of the pole here of the two archetypes. The witch, life-sustaining, loving, nurturing, protective. You can read it. Knowledge of nighttime consciousness, knowledge of the darkness. And for Jung, I keep mixing up Jung and Pan. I wonder what's going on. Some of the positive attributes there. We come to the culmination in terms of our Goya paintings, and we are reminded that Goya's paintings are satire. We are holding these images in paradox. Again, also appreciating that there is a difference between the horn deity depicted here and Pan. And yet, how do the figures of Pan and the witch, if we can meet them with the courage of Vasilisa, with the honesty and wonder of Jung and the childlike perspective of play, of imagination, what can we learn about ourselves, about the world that we are now inhabiting? And I wanted to end with the same quote that we began with. People do not exploit a nature that speaks to them. And to appreciate the capacity for the witch and Pan to help us learn the language of the wilderness, of nature, of the other, so that we may indeed, all of us, be spoken to and come into an enchanted relationship with, or a re-enchanted relationship with the earth, ourselves, and each other. And with that, I will close and open this up. Thank you all very much. I am excited to further this conversation.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Gosh, I have so many thoughts. Voris, you were mentioned a couple times in the middle of that talk, and I was thinking about you a good bit too. Would you like to kick us off?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Ryan, I expect a golden beetle to fly into my room at any moment. Just an absolutely wonderful talk for me on so many levels. And it's really synchronicity, excuse me, because just like you, I've just finished reading The Black Sun, right? Where in contrast to Saul, in contrast to Negredo, darkness is talked about as having its own illuminating light and its own possibilities, that sort of thing. And that's interesting to me, of course, because of my interest in the dark feminine, which Marian Woodman claims is an oxymoron, because for her, the feminine is always dark and creative, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'll do is, I have a question to ask, but you also mentioned the quote. So I'll start with that, and then I'll ask you a question. And again, it's just, I really enjoy it. In Toni Morrison's work, or a lot of work in African-American lit, the wild, the wilderness, is seen as a place of possibility, a place of escape, right? Because it's daily life that's the nightmare, not the forest. So in my own mind, I've always thought of it that way. But as you and I exchanged earlier, Jack Halberstam, who was interested in the other and queer theory, and what I enjoyed about your work is you took the other seriously in a very thoughtful sort of way. And after reading this, I said, damn, because it made me rethink wildness. Wildness has no goal, no point of liberation that beckons off in the distance, no shape that must be assumed, no outcome that must be clear, desired. Wildness instead disorder desire, and desires disorder. And you thought about it in relationship to the last painting of Pan, so you could take that any way you want. But certainly, wildness is there for itself, not for us necessarily. And so that gave me another reading. And my question is around otherness, or the negative constellation of Pan, which you referred to earlier. And again, this is from, and it makes me think of Esther Harding's work around the libido, around violence, that sort of thing. I want you to respond to, because we discussed this, so you, wildness indeed has simultaneously provided the lexicon for massive systems of violence and the justification for the removal of Native and Black peoples. And you did a great job of talking about the negative constellation. So this is just an opportunity for you to elaborate on what you've already discussed. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you, Voris. And I'm grateful you reached out to me beforehand, because you furthered my own thinking processes around this. And the conundrum of the opposites, and I think the conundrum of wildness as it has been weaponized to oppress Black, Indigenous, people of color, the queer community, and simultaneously there's a romanticizing of the wilderness. I think we see, especially almost in an exponential way. And you got me thinking about who has safe access to spaces that are wild, the wild spaces that are remaining now. It's, me, Patagonia wearing white people a lot of the time, North Face, but it's a serious question, and certainly don't have the answer for it, but I've found a deepening of my own understanding through the witch and through Pan. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Paul Redbond, in his latest book, calls Pan the personification of the other.
Yeah.
And in terms of negative, and I'll stop with this, the wildness or the wilderness, of course, links up with the frontier and indigenous people here. So one could think of the wilderness or the wild as a place of knowledge, of epistemologies, of knowledges that have been subdued, suppressed, and driven underground. So they're not really clear in a way, are empty. They actually contain knowledges or epistemologies. And I think your work opens it up for that kind of discussion. So again, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Betsy or Laura, I saw you, or Dennis. I see all y'all want to jump in. And we have some time, so please, Betsy, do you want to join us?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Ryan, that was a beautiful presentation, and everything you brought up just resonated with me so much. I just also finished reading The Dark Sun. And a dream came to me recently during my studies in my analytic studies to explore and write a paper on Lilith, who, is in many ways the Sumerian version of the feminine Pan. And I find it interesting that Lilith in the Zohar refused to be dominated by Adam, and she fled the Garden of Eden and into the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this juxtaposition between the domesticated Garden of Eden and the wilderness, but she quickly became demonized. And she would sneak back into the garden and have intercourse with Adam while he was asleep, and thus was blamed for his spontaneous nocturnal emissions. And I remember reading that in Hillman's essay that you referenced to us, how Pan is also blamed for that kind of dark aspect of nature. But what comes to mind right now is how our projections onto wilderness has changed over time. And when the colonists first came to this country, they saw wilderness, which included the people that lived here already. And quickly the quest was to domesticate it. And so Manifest Destiny became, part of that domestication. And so the wilderness was the projection onto wilderness was that it was evil, uncontrollable, something that needed to be brought under submission.
Mhm.
And now, when we have so little wilderness, it's romanticized, and we protect wild spaces, and they're delicate, and we preserve them. And the geographer Yifu Tuan years ago talked about how ironic that was, because to put wilderness and preservation together, wilderness can't be preserved. It's beyond that. And so he's like, well, where are we projecting that our unconscious, that our lack of connection with the unconscious now? And he would say, onto the urban areas, onto the cities.
Mm-hmm.
So he would say that's the new wilderness.
Hmm.
But that's just, there's lots of ways that we can go with that metaphor. But those are some of the thoughts that came to me while you were speaking, and then on what Boris was saying as well.
If I might share really quickly in response, you reminded me of, through sharing the Lilith mythology and her visits to Adam in the night, how relics of the Virgin and the Mother made it into the global traditions, right? Into new mythologies and iconographies. But the crone is the piece that really was severed.
Mm-hmm.
And Barbara Walker talking about that a lot. And the crone, because of her power, her proximity to the mysteries of life and death, and Celine's visitations to Endymion, who is in a sleep. That there are these relics of feminine sexuality that are dark, or of a nature that's contrary to rationalism, right? These nighttime visits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. That's what surfaced from the depths for me in response.
And I just a micro note on the crone thing. So interesting that the lost crone, because of course the elder is always the symbol of wisdom, right? And so to have that be the feminine figure that's lost, that also is an interesting wound. Laura, you wanted to share some thoughts.
Thank you. Ryan, thank you so much. I'm so happy that I finally got to see your presentation. I missed it in Chicago, so very happy to be here. It was fantastic. I was thinking about the witch archetype, and the way in which you presented the polarities and all of her potentiality. Really made me think. And then Boris, and you're speaking of like that the lack of accessibility to wilderness, and I had just this image pop up from some protest in where a coven of witches had gathered together currently to hex Donald Trump. And it made me think sort of contextually how the witch archetype is very much present in our modern day culture. And I think it's becoming the archetype, maybe not accessibility to some of her old tools or environment, but the archetype in new ways, I think is becoming much more accepted, and is, I think anecdotally, I see young teenagers experimenting with this archetype, and in the sort of personal empowerment that disconnects from a organized religion or from some sort of other institution of power or rules, right? So it's this freedom that comes from the archetype itself. And I think too, just the sense of like the idea of a coven, right? How this has become like a cultural movement. And so I'm thinking of how we have this, we've been cut off from the wilderness. We've been cut off from that component of the enchantment, and we so desperately need this return. But yet this particular archetype, there's this resurgence. And I found it interesting. I haven't thought beyond that, but I was wondering if you had thoughts on that phenomenon.
I do. It opens up a lot of different thoughts, Laura, and thank you for joining. It's good to see you. It makes me curious about what unconsciously is coming into formation, not only reactively, but creatively. And you brought consciousness to the fact that I didn't really speak to the coven. And I wonder why that is. Granted, it was a limited presentation hour. Goya's paintings depicted a few images to that. And so I think it might speak to my small little sliver of this, of thinking hyper individualistically. Where is the sense of community? A product of a society and a culture that places such emphasis on individualism, distinct from Jung's individuation, of course, right? Which brings us closer into relationship. So you point out a place of unconsciousness for me, Laura, that I didn't even use the word coven. Thank you.
That was not my intention.
No, but it's great. It's great. I appreciate that because it's got me thinking about that.
Well, and I think the way in which you painted the archetype of the witch in your stories was very much the witch of the sort of the othering, right? The witch in where those in the civilized area could place all the attributes onto the singular hag of a woman in her crow-footed house and not have to worry about it. But this is it's a different beast in a cultural community context. It takes on I think a different sort of collective intention.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will, should I?
Yeah, I figured you'd just jump right in. Please do.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And I'm watching the clock too, so I'll only take a couple of minutes. Ryan, I had a panic attack when you realized that you had no notes to fly with. And you just, boy, did you keep your cool all the way through. I mean, it was, so I became Pan there for a few minutes and you leveled it out. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
Also, thank you for sending us back to Pan and the Nightmare. I hadn't read Jim's work for many years, and it was an absolute treat to go back and, as we all know, what a joy it is to reread works that have influenced us and inspired us. I want to be an emissary here for just a minute or two to share a poem by William Wordsworth that he wrote in 1802, and he published it in 1807. And it's a remarkable sonnet because in 14 lines, he gives us two mythologies. And one I'm going to call the mythology of alienation. And the second mythology is a mythology of integration or renewal. So I'd like to read it, and I'd like to have all of you hear it. And then Ryan, if there's anything there that tripwires your thinking, maybe you could offer that. It's entitled "The World is Too Much with Us." The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. End of the first myth. Enter the second myth. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So 2 mythologies in 14 lines. It's such a remarkable, tight poem about reclaiming the mythopoetics of history and a reconnection to the natural order through these mythic figures that you and James Hillman have just really promoted so beautifully. So if there was anything there that you might like to respond to, that would be wonderful.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I had a panic attack too. The line, little we see in nature that is ours.
Yeah.
Oh. In being with the paradox of it, have to be with the poem and see it a few more times, but my initial response was the othering of nature, not seeing ourselves reflected in nature.
Yeah.
Having permission to then exploit it. Then on the other side of it, little we see in nature that is ours, it isn't ours. Going to what Boris was speaking to about wildness.
Yeah.
There's that, this, I don't think I need to say more. It's not ours.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Dennis, I want to jump in and say something at this point ahead of our new guest, Dennis Merritt. I know he wants to say something, but you said rereading it. And I'm struck by how rereading is always influenced by, or generally influenced by, the previous reading. And the previous reading owns or sets up a kind of a territory or control over what it is that you're now reading. So it's very difficult to kind of look back at our own past or at something that we think we understand with new eyes, to have a beginner's mind of something such that the thing that we're now experiencing, we're experiencing its wildness, its birthing coming to us without the prejudice of what we read before. So in looking at this, at the thing that you just read, the hardest thing is to reread something as if we haven't read it before, as if we haven't experienced it before, or to walk down the path of, as T.S. Eliot would say, to arrive at the place and know it for the first time. And I think this is the challenge we have with how patterns of recognition influence what we think we have. We're deeply influenced by all of the things that we've conditioned ourselves to become. So you know, just throwing that out there, you know, to kind of prejudice where we're going. And let's welcome Dennis Merritt. I'd love to hear you talk and hear what you're going to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ryan, for setting such a great mythic table for us here. Nice to be on a panel with two men named after Dionysus. Just several thoughts. In fact, many thoughts. I actually read Pan and the Nightmare for the first time the last couple of days. Have been sitting on my bookshelf for years. Incredible. That's another whole dimension. But so I grew up on a dairy farm, and I could relate a lot to what Pan is about. You're talking about manure and pee and mating and birthing calves and all that sort of stuff. And I found it very interesting that for a symbol of nature, we have a goat. It's probably one of the easier animals for us to domesticate. So I see Pan as that transitional period between the wilderness and domestication. He was both a god associated with the woods, but also the fields in the pastoral area. If you look at Artemis, I mean, part of her power and association with nature and the purity of nature was she could tame the bear, and animals really hard to tame, but to tame a goat. So I really see Pan and the goat as kind of that transitional period. Thinking of my own ancestry, my Czech ancestors came to Wisconsin and cut down a lot of trees in the 1860s to make farms. So that transition from kind of hunter-gatherer in a way to farming, the Neolithic, agriculture, that's when we began to dominate nature. And somebody made a comment before about the wilderness disappearing. And I think this is much more than a metaphor. I think our species, starting with agriculture, manipulating nature so much, our population is increasing, and then eventually science, capitalism, all that stuff. We've evolved to what I think is our endpoint. And we can't come to terms with climate change. And those shocks associated with PAM and things like earthquakes and floods and all that sort of stuff, they're going to be coming much more frequently. And then you think of the pandemic. I mean, one of the reasons that started is because these wet markets, and also humans getting more and more into jungle areas and stuff like that. I am also a virologist. So the viruses, every plant and animal has viruses. So this pandemic is being described as nature's revenge. And then the other aspect, you look what's going on in the Ukraine. Well, why does Russia have so much money? It's because of fossil fuels. And where those fossil fuels come from? They came from millions and millions of years of wilderness building up what eventually became coal and oil supplies. And now the countries that are rich in that, they all seem to be corrupted. I mean, look at Venezuela and Russia and so on. So I see that as some way related to what's happening in Ukraine, on top of which Ukraine has been kind of a breadbasket in Europe. So there you have your agriculture again, and the droughts and everything caused by our activities are going to increase the problems in the world and the likelihood of more shocks and more pandemics. So that's just kind of one take on it, but especially being from the farm, and just to touch a bit upon Hillman, and as a male, Hillman made such a big case that that Pan and the association with rape and masturbation and that sort of thing, that is part of our instinctual realm, which is a lot associated with sex. And I think especially for men, we experience those drives in the sexual realm because of testosterone. And you look at the animal kingdom and how many dominant males there are, and we can't call it crazy, but the natural stuff they do. And at our deep level, kind of the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and so on, which is very emotional, that's still very much a part of us. And we have to be so careful, and I think the feminists have to be careful how they talk about those energies. Sometimes I get the sense that The problem is that men just aren't women. So there is a difference, and as a male, I've often been sensitive to feeling that everything is blamed on the phallocentric or whatever. And I think Hillman is trying to say the reality is that this kind of pan phallic-y energy is real. It's a base of our psyches, and the best thing is to acknowledge it's there, and then the power comes in when you have the fully developed male and the fully developed female. And Hermes is about the gap in his wand, and it's the relationship with those two, and that's where soul is generated, according to Hillman. So that's a long statement with a lot of stuff, but that's my dairy farmer's comment.
Thank you for sharing that, Dennis, and being here. Your seminar some years ago and the Merlin volume of the Dairy Farmer's Guide to the Universe have been really influential for me. I was thinking as you were speaking about Jung's insistence that the capacity to reflect is an instinct. And Hillman does describe Pan as the herdsman above the herd, that he does have the ability to be an observer. And I think he speaks to even a lot of the art and paintings, not the ones we went over today, because we're really zeroing in on Pan, but most of them have him positioned off to the side, not the center, watching what's occurring. And I think through, not by disowning the instinctual, the sexual, the phallocentric, but moving through those, we can access the other side of the archetype, the Pan, the observer, Pan who has the capacity to reflect.
Yeah, there was one more aspect where that transformative ability of the symbol was so important. The goddess that was the nymph that Pan pursued, and she turned herself into a reed. So Pan couldn't rape her, if you will, but he made the Pan pipe from that. So there you have something of the spirit associated with breath that is kind of transforming his lust and that drivenness. Mm-hmm. And let's not forget Hermes' very close relationship to the Selenoi and to Pan. And so many of the traits and what Hermes then represents is the connection to that animal world, the mute animal world at the lower end, but then he is the bridge to the Apollonic realm in that myth of Hermes stealing Apollo's cattle. So that hermetic dimension, I think we really have to remember when we talk about Pan.
Diane, do you have some thoughts for us tonight?
Yeah, I do indeed. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was so rich, and the images, the cadence of your voice, I felt nourished without being stuffed. and it was very stimulating. Okay. So I had a few just questions or observations. One is, could we think about the difference between what we project onto wilderness, what we consider to be wilderness, and what is nature? I love the quote that you began and ended, what nature that you listen to. And nature is all around us, and we can listen to it even if there isn't a vast wilderness out there that we live at the edge of. I think it's harder. I used to live at the edge of a huge wilderness preserve, right at the very edge of it. And I could go into it and wander through steep hillsides and a redwood forest and down creek beds and all over, and I wouldn't see any other human beings. I no longer live there, and I live in a town, and it's a little harder to find what I would think of as wilderness, but nature is very present. And so I wonder about that difference. And then I was thinking about the archetype of the witch, and how much is what you're talking about an archetype, and how much of the old hags riding the brooms, how much are they a projection and a rejection of the pagan nature worship that was endemic to Europe and was suppressed by the Christian church, and also by the Greek tradition that came in. If we just think of Europe for a minute, the Greek tradition that came into influence the Catholic Church as well. It's kind of rationalism and eventually materialism. So are we looking at the archetype of the witch, or do you think we might be looking at a projection of something evil and ugly onto and fear of the connection with the mysteries of nature, and with being able to listen to nature and know about the healing and the otherworldly quality, what we call otherworldly qualities that one experiences that transcend ordinary experience and can come through experiences in the natural world, which are extremely threatening to the kind of order that we have in our world now. So I wondered if you could comment on those things.
Thank you for being here. Precisely, I'll go with the witch archetype versus the projection.
Mm-hmm.
I endeavored to capture both because, and I'm glad you're lifting this up, because that projection is so important to recognize. And the genocide of women deemed witches, and Goya's paintings as the criticism of those movements, that were diminishing the power of the crone, or the being who has that close relationship to the natural world and its mysteries. And I also was found so struck and hooked by the witch as an image apart from that, at least as conscious as I can be of it. The witch that scared me in childhood, the witch and the Wizard of Oz, the Baba Yaga, the witch in the fairy tales, and the psychological amplifications of that archetype as a resource for further understanding. My own psychology, what might be occurring collectively. So to distill it back down, I try to capture both. Both of which as it might articulate itself through an archetypal nature, and also the negative projections, the shadow projections of what we saw with movement away from paganism. I felt very soothed by the delineation between nature and wilderness. You know, it was like calming. You're absolutely right. Nature is everywhere to be found. And maybe that's a doorway through a further enchanted relationship with this planet. You know, one that can wilderness certain areas. I know there are movements to around the world to create wilderness out of ecosystems that have been damaged. Well, like Dennis says, though, you know, we are confronting an unleashing of these forces through climate change that we are ill-equipped to be prepared for. So the Earth might have intentions that just far exceed our little efforts. You know? So yeah.
You know,
melting. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking about the how's the Arctic going to change, right? As the permafrost melts, all the microorganisms underneath there, the potential viruses that exist, right? So that cauldrony energy depicted in the hurricane over the Gulf of Mexico with the cauldron, I think those energies are at work, bidden or not.
One of the things I wanted to appreciate in this conversation is just how attentive everyone has been to the fact that when you're talking about Pan, you're playing with fire. You know, like on one hand, you know, we want to encourage you know, rebuilding of that relationship, and on another, nobody's letting us go more than 5 seconds without reminding ourselves that you're also playing with fire when you're playing with these energies. And I think that's really wonderful, because I think it can be too easy to just kind of idolize this reconnection with Pan and nature, but we have to remember that also means a reconnection with instinct. And instinct is I think not without its own power drives and its own, you know, that we see. I keep thinking about, you know, you mentioned Pan is dead. Well, of course, this may have been one of the things Jesus meant when he said, I'll build my church on this rock, because here he was at Hebron, where the angels mated with the, you know, the Jews to make the Nephilim, but also here is the mouth of the River Jordan. And the mouth of the River Jordan is where they sacrificed all the goats to Pan. And at the time of Jesus's life, it was flowing red, like it was a hellscape. It was like more sacrifice of goats than we can possibly imagine, and there more than anywhere else in the world. And so here's the place just bleeding with Pan and sacrifice that Jesus says, and I will build my church on this rock. And he could have meant 5 things by that, but one of them may have been, you know, on the fact that Pan is this is a dangerous thing. This is a dark thing that needs responded to. But I wanted to go, you know, now I'm doing my balance. Like let's talk about the danger, but also about the beauty. And the other thing I wanted to mention, and for me, here's my Pan, precious to my childhood here, who sits with his pan pipe. And by the way, since the Russian Baba Yagas came in right next to my witches here, but to me, there's something that's been really profound to me about just a personal lesson around wilderness that I'd love to share, which is just that we tend to think of wilderness as overwhelming and overpowering, and therefore needing to be restrained. And of course, this later gets projected onto the feminine just as much, in the way that the male psyche can be afraid of feminine potencies that might look more wild and more scary than this you know, hyper masculinized version of order. And one thing that I've come to learn is that wilderness isn't always overpowering. Sometimes it's preciously fragile. And that when somebody's in a state of trying to rekindle their own relationship with wilderness, typically that wilderness isn't looking for fan of air to blow against its flame to grow. Typically, my experience is that part of somebody looking to find that ability to rekindle their wilderness, they're looking for safety. They're looking for a safe place to be wild, a comfortable and acceptable zone in which we can be that instinctual self, where there isn't maybe some of the damage that we're all afraid of inflicting when we go there. So those are some of the thoughts that you were bringing to me during all this, and I wondered if you'd have any responses to any of those, Ryan.
Grateful that you're shining light on that piece, and how seeking out the medicine of the wilderness might be a part of collective change and renewal. Another theme that I think we were circling this evening, the descent and the renewal. And I think wilderness plays a central role in that. And I agree as well, perhaps the Pan did die and he is no longer dead right now with what we see occurring. I think Paul Robichaud does say as much in his recent book that Voris quoted a while back. But yeah, Will, I think absolutely what the wilderness has such potential for medicine, for enchantment.
Betsy, do you have some thoughts for us before we run out of time?
Yeah, I just want to say, this is so great. I appreciate Gary Snyder's definition of wilderness. Gary Snyder, the Buddhist eco-poet, and he calls wilderness wholeness. And he says that human beings came out of that wholeness. And that wilderness is a place where everything can flourish according to its own nature. And I would include human beings in that. And so for me, wilderness is a place where individuation can truly happen, where a tree can be a tree, a person can be a person. But we know from biodiversity studies, everything is interconnected. A tree cannot exist without the mycelium, without the birds. And, humans have this tendency to think that, I speak from my own experience, that I'm different than that, but I'm not. And so when the ego can finally realize we're part of this bigger system, then there's a good relationship with the wilderness, and which I think goes hand in hand with a relationship with the unconscious, with the totality of psyche.
It seems to me that what we are really looking for is a way to reinvigorate the humility that we might have had in a relationship of oneness with the natural world, with ourselves, with one another. The root of humility is humus, and that's the earth. At one time, all the gods were nature gods. We didn't have sky gods. Or the sky, when we did have a sky god, was a part of nature. It wasn't separate from it. And this interconnection is something that is a felt relationship. David Abram talks about other than human. And not that it is some other species or some other type of being, but we're all one big organism. I mean, we all share the same world, and we are part of a world that is incapable of being divided. It's only perception and projections and the human mind that imagines that these separations have any efficacy. The world doesn't see us as separate. It just carries us through it. And so, let's put it out there. Anybody want to jump in with any last comments? And Forrest, you want to say something else? I always love hearing you talk, brother,
I appreciate that. My mother would disagree, but I appreciate that.
I'm not your mother.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly, Dana. And I think as an archetype and as an image, this is what Jung is getting at in Memory, Dreams, and Reflection, when he talks about the rhizome, is a radical interconnection, right? That takes into account nature, the cosmos, et cetera, et cetera. And Jung even said, right, and I'm going to quote, paraphrase, that at the end, all that remains is the rhizome, this kind of life, energy, life force, et cetera, that takes into account everything. In quantum physics, it would just be called basic energy, right? So I agree with you, the argument for radical relationality. The problem is, as Applebaum, she argues, is that you have a personality in the world that is against disorder, that is against creativity, and is against uncertainty, and that is part of the authoritarian mind. And this takes us back to what was being discussed earlier. So, again, it's that tension of the opposites, because it's also part of our nature, right, for folks to want certainty.
Those three contributions feel like such a summary and condensation of a sprawling conversation this evening. And I think so, if we can utilize those avenues that get us into the rhizome, Boris, that you're talking about, how can we come to places of a relational understanding to the planet, to each other?
Dennis, you want to have one final comment?
Yeah, how about a comment from somebody who grew up in Wisconsin, but made a big name for himself in California, John Muir. He said, "In wildness is the preservation of the world."
Excellent. I love California poets, which is why I picked Robinson Jeffers, who actually went to my alma mater, Occidental College. The last line of that was, "Love that," he says, referring to nature, the oneness. Love that, not man apart from that. So as we complete another Myth Salon, I'd like to thank everyone who gives generously of their time and came here to support Ryan. Betsy, it's nice to see you. Dennis, both Dennises. Dennis, anyway, both Dennises. You guys are great. Forrest, always a pleasure. Diane, Laura, nice to really meet you. This has been a great evening. But instead of saying more, let me say less, and let's go out with a moment of silence, please. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Ryan.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Ryan.
Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Ryan.
everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care,
Please
everyone.
are howling
This evening.
wildness.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks.